I worked overnight at a sea barrier because the contract was short, the pay was high, and the location was isolated enough that no one expected much to go wrong, which made it perfect for a guy like me who'd learned not to ask too many questions. My name's Marcus Webb, I'm 28, and at the time I was doing private security work for infrastructure sites, dams, substations, flood controls, anything critical but boring enough that companies preferred one warm body over a full team. The sea barrier sat several miles outside a small coastal town that was already half abandoned, a long concrete wall reinforced with steel gates designed to keep storm surges from pushing inland. From a distance it looked simple, almost elegant, a straight line dividing land and water. Up close, it felt wrong, like a scar that hadn't healed properly. I arrived just before sunset on my first shift, black hoodie pulled tight against the wind, dark jeans and steel-toe boots crunching on salt-stained gravel as I parked beside the security office. The air smelled like rust, seawater and wet concrete, sharp enough to sting my nose. Waves rolled in on the far side of the barrier, steady and rhythmic, while the landward side was eerily calm, a shallow basin of still water and exposed mud that reflected the sky like a mirror. Inside the office, a man named Hargreave was finishing the day shift. He was older, late 50s maybe, with a weathered face and hands that never stopped moving, tapping the desk, adjusting papers like stillness made him nervous. He gave me a quick rundown: patrol every 45 minutes, monitor the pressure gauges on the gates, log any anomalies. Then he hesitated, reached into a drawer and pulled out a single laminated sheet. No company logo, no signatures, just text. "These are the boundary rules," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Rule 1, remain on the landward side of the barrier after dark. Rule 2, do not attempt to mark or measure the boundary manually. Rule 3, if the boundary appears altered, log the time and return to the office immediately. Rule 4, do not respond to sounds from the water side. Rule 5, if visual markers shift, do not correct them." I looked up at him and asked what he meant by boundary. He didn't answer directly. "You'll see," he said. "Or you won't. Depends how good you are at following rules." He left a few minutes later, his truck's taillights disappearing down the access road, and the silence settled in fast. Night came hard and heavy out there. The wind picked up, carrying the constant crash of waves from the far side of the barrier, while the basin behind it stayed unnaturally quiet. On my first patrol, everything looked normal. The painted boundary line along the top of the barrier was straight and clean, the warning markers evenly spaced, the water line sitting exactly where the schematic said it should be. I logged it, checked the cameras, and went back inside. Around 10, fog rolled in off the sea, thick and low, clinging to the concrete until the floodlights turned it into a glowing wall. The sound of the waves changed then, deeper somehow, less chaotic, like something breathing slowly just out of sight. On my second patrol, I noticed the first discrepancy. One of the yellow boundary markers on the barrier had shifted. Not fallen over, not damaged, just moved. Maybe a foot closer to the landward side than it had been earlier. I told myself it was a trick of the fog, logged it like the rules said, and went back inside. By midnight, 2 more markers had shifted, each one subtly closer than before, redrawing a line that was supposed to be permanent. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the concrete, feeling a strange pressure in my head, like the space around the barrier was tightening. That's when I heard it. A sound from the water side, low and deliberate, like something heavy adjusting its weight. It wasn't a splash. It was the displacement of water by something large and patient. I felt the instinct to lean over the barrier just a little to confirm what I was hearing. Rule 4 flashed in my mind. Do not respond. I backed away instead, heart pounding, and returned to the office. On the cameras, the water beyond the barrier looked wrong. Too smooth, too dark. The boundary line on the feed didn't match the one I'd just seen with my own eyes. On screen, it was farther out. In reality, it was closer. The boundary wasn't fixed. It was being redrawn quietly, incrementally, like something testing how much space it was allowed to take. I logged the discrepancy with shaking hands and sat there listening to the waves, realizing the sea barrier wasn't just holding water back. It was negotiating with something that didn't respect lines at all. SSS, The second night started with the boundary already wrong, and that was the part that unsettled me most. I hadn't even stepped out of the office yet when I noticed it on the cameras. The painted line along the top of the barrier, the one meant to match the physical markers, didn't line up the way it had during my last patrol. It was subtle, just enough that I had to rewind the footage from earlier in the evening to be sure I wasn't imagining it. An hour ago, the line sat clean and straight. Now it bowed inward slightly, like the concrete itself had shifted. I told myself it was camera distortion, fog messing with perspective, but the pressure behind my eyes returned the moment I leaned closer to the screen. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out anyway, black hoodie pulled tight, boots echoing softly on concrete that felt colder than it should have been. The fog was thicker tonight, clinging to the barrier so tightly that the water side was nothing but a gray void filled with sound. Waves didn't crash so much as roll and settle, a heavy, deliberate rhythm that made it hard to tell where one ended and the next began. When I reached the first marker, my stomach dropped. It had moved again. Not fallen, not loosened, just relocated, now sitting several inches closer to the landward edge. The concrete beneath it was dry, no scrape marks, no signs it had been dragged. It was as if it had always been there and my memory was the faulty thing. I logged the time, forced myself to turn away, and continued the patrol like the rules demanded. By the time I reached the far end of the barrier, 3 more markers had shifted, all in the same direction, all by roughly the same amount. The boundary wasn't collapsing. It was advancing. I felt that pull again, stronger this time, the urge to correct it, to move the markers back where they belonged, to assert that the line was fixed because it was supposed to be. Rule 5 stopped me cold. Do not correct them. I stepped back instead, palms sweating, and that was when the sound came again from the water side. Not movement this time, but something closer to friction, like a broad surface sliding slowly against another. The fog seemed to thicken in response, muffling everything else until that single sound dominated. I stood there longer than I should have, frozen between instinct and instruction, until a new noise cut through it. A faint, wet exhale, close enough that it felt like it brushed the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. I walked back to the office with measured steps, refusing to run, refusing to look over the barrier even though every nerve in my body screamed that something was right there, just out of sight, testing how far it could push without being acknowledged. Inside, I locked the door and watched the cameras instead. The feeds didn't match each other anymore. On one angle, the boundary markers were where I'd just seen them. On another, they were farther out, as if the barrier extended into the sea itself. The system couldn't decide which version was correct, so it showed both. Around 11, the gauges on the gate controls began to fluctuate. Not wildly, just enough to notice, pressure rising and falling in a slow, uneven pattern that didn't correspond to wave height or flow rate. I logged it. Midnight came and went, and the fog never lifted. Instead, it pressed closer to the barrier lights until the glow reflected back on itself, turning the whole structure into a floating outline. That was when I heard voices for the first time. Not shouting, not calling for help, just talking, conversational, drifting in from the water side as if carried on the fog. I couldn't make out words at first, just the cadence, the rise and fall of speech. Then a phrase cut through clearly enough to make my chest tight. "It's moved again." The voice sounded human, tired, like someone stating an obvious problem during a long shift. Another voice answered, lower, calmer. "It always does." I stayed where I was, staring at the door, hands clenched into fists, repeating Rule 4 in my head until the words lost meaning. The voices lingered for several minutes, discussing the boundary like it was a shared concern, like they were standing just on the other side of the barrier with clipboards and flashlights, doing the same job I was. When they finally faded, the silence felt heavier than the sound had. By dawn, the markers had shifted again. The boundary line on the barrier now sat nearly a foot closer to the landward side than it had when I'd started the contract. When Hargreave returned for the morning handoff, he didn't look surprised. He checked the logs, nodded once, and said, "It's accelerating." I asked him what happened when it reached the end. He closed the logbook carefully and met my eyes. "That depends," he said, "on whether anyone tries to stop it. By the third night, the barrier no longer felt like a structure so much as a suggestion, a polite request being quietly ignored. I arrived early, hoping daylight would make things feel more stable, but the moment I stepped out of my truck I knew that hope was pointless. The air was heavier than it had been the previous nights, damp enough that my hoodie clung to my back, and the smell of seawater carried farther inland than it should have. From the parking area I could already see the problem. The painted boundary line atop the barrier had shifted again, not in a clean curve this time, but in uneven segments, as if different sections of the wall had agreed to different terms. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, feeling that familiar pressure build behind my eyes, the sense that the space around me was subtly rearranging itself while I watched. Hargreave hadn't arrived yet, which meant I was alone with it. I unlocked the office, logged in, and forced myself to stick to routine. Cameras first. The feeds were worse tonight. Some angles showed the barrier extending farther into the water than I knew was physically possible. Others showed the water line already touching the landward side in places it hadn't reached yet in reality. Timestamps didn't match across feeds, off by seconds, sometimes minutes, like the system couldn't agree on when things were happening, let alone where. I logged the discrepancies with hands that felt slightly numb and went out on patrol anyway, because avoiding the barrier entirely felt like acknowledging it had already won. The fog rolled in just after sunset, thick enough that the floodlights didn't cut through so much as illuminate a few feet of concrete before fading into gray nothing. As I walked, I noticed new marks on the barrier surface, dark, wet streaks that ran vertically down the concrete on the water side as if something had leaned there repeatedly, leaving residue behind. They weren't algae or rust. They were too fresh, too irregular. I didn't touch them. I didn't get close enough to smell them. I logged them and moved on. Halfway down the barrier, the sound changed. The waves beyond the wall stopped crashing altogether. Instead, the water moved in long, slow surges, each one pressing against the concrete with deliberate pressure before easing back. With every surge, I felt it in my chest, a subtle vibration that made my heartbeat feel slightly out of sync with itself. I slowed my steps, boots echoing too loudly in the quiet, and that was when I heard the footsteps. Not on the concrete, not behind me, but from the water side, paced to match mine exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I took a step, they followed. I stood there, breath held, refusing to turn, refusing to acknowledge it, repeating the rules in my head like a mantra. Do not respond. Do not measure. Do not correct. The footsteps lingered for several seconds, then faded back into the sound of moving water. I didn't finish that patrol. I went straight back to the office, locked the door, and sat with my back against it, listening to the pump's hum and the barrier creak under pressure it wasn't designed to bear. Around midnight, the voices returned, clearer than before. They spoke from multiple points along the water side, overlapping slightly like a conversation carried out by people who didn't need to look at each other to communicate. They talked about the boundary the way engineers talk about load limits and tolerances, casually, professionally. It's too tight here, one voice said. Then shift it, another replied. We've got room. I covered my ears, not because it helped, but because not reacting felt like the only control I had left. On the cameras, I watched the painted line redraw itself again, sections of it creeping inward while others lagged behind, the barrier no longer a single edge but a patchwork of compromises. Just before dawn, the landward basin flooded another few inches without any corresponding surge event. The boundary had moved again, and this time it didn't bother hiding it. When Hargreave arrived at sunrise, he took one look at the barrier and sighed. They're going to bring in observers, he said quietly. I asked what that meant. He picked up the logbook, flipped through my entries, and closed it with deliberate care. It means, he said, that tonight is when they decide whether this line is still worth defending. The observers arrived just before dusk, and the way they showed up told me everything I needed to know about how seriously this was being taken. No marked vehicles, no uniforms, just two dark SUVs that rolled down the access road without headlights and parked beside the office like they'd been here 100 times before. 3 men stepped out, all male, all quiet, all dressed the same way: dark jackets, work pants, boots meant for wet ground. No logos, no badges. One of them carried a hard plastic case that he never let out of his hand. Hargreave went stiff the moment he saw them. He didn't greet them. He didn't introduce me. He just stepped aside and let them in like this was no longer his sight. Inside the office, the atmosphere changed immediately. One of the observers opened the case and pulled out equipment I didn't recognize, handheld sensors, analog dials, devices with no screens at all. They ignored the cameras entirely. That stood out to me. They weren't interested in what we were seeing. They were interested in what the barrier was doing. One of them finally spoke, his voice low and precise. "How fast is it redrawing?" Hargreave handed over the logbook without a word. The man skimmed it, nodded once, and said, "That's within tolerance." I felt a flash of anger cut through my fear. "Tolerance for what?" I asked. All three of them turned to look at me at the same time, not hostile, evaluative, like I'd just made a noise they hadn't expected. The one with the case answered. "For attention," he said. "It's responding faster now because it's being observed too consistently." That made my stomach drop. I told him the boundary had moved even when no one was outside. He shook his head slightly. "You don't need to be outside," he said. "Watching is enough." They ordered the floodlights on the water side shut down completely. No discussion. When Hargreave hesitated, one of them looked at him and said, "You don't want to give it reference points." The lights went dark, plunging the barrier into a gray blur where concrete and water blended together. Almost immediately, the sound changed. The waves smoothed out, their rhythm slowing, becoming more deliberate. Something large shifted against the far side of the wall, and this time there was no mistaking it. The barrier bowed, not cracked, not failed. It flexed inward slightly like a spine adjusting under pressure. One of the observers placed a sensor against the concrete and smiled faintly. "There it is," he said. "Negotiation phase." The word hit me harder than any scream could have. Negotiation meant there were terms. It meant the boundary wasn't just being pushed, it was being discussed. The fog rolled in thick and fast after full dark, erasing the horizon entirely. With the lights off, the only reference we had left was sound, and the voices came back almost immediately, not shouted, not whispered, spoken clearly, confidently from multiple points along the barrier. They talked to each other, not to us. "This section's too rigid. Shift it inland. We're being watched again." One of the observers raised a finger signaling silence and adjusted one of his instruments. The reading spiked. "See," he murmured, "it reacts to certainty." I realized then that the rules weren't about safety. They were behavioral controls. Don't measure, don't correct, don't respond. Because any assertion that the boundary was real gave it something to push against. Around midnight, the barrier redrew itself dramatically. Not inches, feet. I felt it more than I saw it, the ground beneath the office trembling as water surged into the basin behind the wall without a wave, without force, just arrival. The observers didn't panic. They packed up calmly. "That's enough," one of them said. "We've confirmed loss of stability." I asked what that meant for the town inland. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "They'll move the maps," he said. "People follow maps." As we evacuated, moving along the access road with water creeping close on both sides, I looked back once despite myself. In the darkness, with no lights to define it, the barrier was no longer a line at all. It was a suggestion being erased in real time. The voices faded as we left, satisfied, like a meeting adjourned. And I understood, finally, that the boundary had never been meant to hold. It had only been meant to delay. 6 months after the observers shut the site down, the sea barrier is officially listed as decommissioned due to structural instability. And if you look at the updated coastal maps, the line where it used to be doesn't exist anymore. The shoreline has been redrawn a few hundred yards inland, clean and authoritative, like it's always been that way. The town closest to the barrier was offered buyouts, quietly and efficiently, and most people took them without much argument. A few didn't. Those houses are gone now, erased by what the news called unpredictable tidal encroachment, a phrase that sounds natural enough until you've watched the water decide where it's allowed to be. I didn't stay in security after that. I finished the contract, got paid on time, and never heard from Hargreave or the observers again. When I tried to look them up later, their names didn't lead anywhere useful. Employment records missing. Addresses that belonged to other people. It was like they'd been temporary markers too, placed just long enough to serve a purpose before being quietly moved. What stuck with me wasn't the fear so much as the understanding. Once you see a boundary redraw itself while you're standing on it, you start noticing how many of them exist only because everyone agrees they do. Property lines, flood zones, evacuation routes. I started seeing reports online about other barriers failing, other sea walls underperforming, always described as engineering miscalculations or budget issues. The language was consistent: managed retreat, adaptive shoreline response, never loss, never failure, just adjustment. A few weeks ago, I got curious and pulled up satellite imagery of the old site. The water was calm, perfectly smooth like glass. No sign there had ever been a wall, no discoloration, no debris field. Just a wide, shallow basin that reflected the sky so cleanly it hurt to look at. I zoomed in as far as I could, and for a moment I thought I saw faint lines beneath the surface, long straight segments that didn't quite match the natural contours of the seabed. Then the image refreshed and they were gone. I don't live near the coast anymore. That was a deliberate choice. I took work inland, maintenance and inspection jobs where the ground stays dry and the boundaries are reinforced with more than concrete and hope. Even so, I still catch myself checking edges, where pavement meets dirt, where a riverbank curves just a little too neatly, where a retaining wall looks newer than the land around it. I don't measure. I don't correct. I don't stand and watch for too long, because I understand now what the observers meant about attention. The barrier didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it was acknowledged, because it was named, marked, logged, and defended as if that made it real. The thing on the other side didn't need force. It needed confirmation. Somewhere out there, another overnight guard is starting a shift at a site like that, being handed a laminated sheet with rules that sound strange but official enough to follow. He'll tell himself it's just policy, just liability, just precaution. And the boundary will hold at first as long as everyone pretends it's fixed. But lines like that don't disappear all at once. They move when no one's looking. They redraw themselves in inches, then feet, then whole stretches of land, until the map updates and the world agrees the new version was always correct. I don't know what the water is, not really. I don't know if it's intelligent in any way we'd recognize, or if it's just following a set of rules older than ours. I only know this: the sea doesn't rush anymore. It doesn't have to. It's learned that if it waits long enough, the boundaries come to it.